Did you know that the most repeated sentence in Europe has never once been checked? Europeans do not need air conditioning. The summers here are mild, the walls are thick, and the American appetite for cold air is something between a weakness and a disease. For 30 years, the old continent has said this about itself, and said it with pride. But in the summer of 2026, after the heat had finished with us, the proud sentence stopped sounding like restraint. Nobody has ever properly explained why Europeans don't have air conditioning. Not the newspapers, not the ministries, not the agencies that lecture us about it every August. And when the explanation finally arrived this summer, no American had to say a word. Europe admitted it in its own documents. A price of 45 cents for a single kilowatt hour, 2.5 times what an American pays. An office tower in Frankfurt cooled all summer long, while the family in the flat above it sleeps on the floor. A landlord's signature that a tenant cannot get. There's even a number, published by Germany's own statistics office, about buildings that are not homes, and it ends the argument on its own. Today, let's take apart the 3 walls standing between a European family and one cold room. The price of the power, the story we tell ourselves about it, and the permission to drill a hole. The price behind the pride. We do not argue about air conditioning on this continent. We explain it, patiently, the way an adult explains something obvious to a child who has asked the same question twice. The European Environment Agency employs an expert whose whole job is planning how our cities survive a warming century. Asked whether air conditioning was the answer, she said she did not think it should be the solution anywhere. Not in Madrid, not in Naples, not in a nursing home in Bavaria in the 4th week of a heat wave. Anywhere. We are not doing this for ourselves, she said. We are doing it for the generations who come after us. The reasoning is offered gently. A machine that makes one room cold pushes its heat out into the street, so the city warms while the flat cools. Ask the French, and 1 in 6 of them will say, out loud, that they would rather sit in the heat than switch the machine on, because the planet matters more than their bedroom does. Spain, Italy, and Greece have written the same instinct into law, capping the cooling in public buildings so that no government office may be brought below 27 degrees Celsius, which is 81 degrees Fahrenheit. The rule is written down. The heat is not. But there's a second document, and it's far less flattering. It's a table of electricity prices, covering the same 6 months on both sides of the Atlantic, in one currency, with every tax and levy in it, so nobody can accuse anybody of comparing a summer to a winter. In the back half of 2025, an American household paid 17.7 cents for a kilowatt hour. A German household paid 45.1. Not every European pays that. A Hungarian household paid 12.6 cents, less than the American did, and that is worth holding on to, because the countries paying the least are never the countries doing the lecturing. Germany doesn't pay a little more than America for electricity. Germany pays 2.5 times more. Every hour that a window unit hums in a bedroom in Ohio costs its owner what a European pays for 24 minutes of the same cold air. And walk into an American hardware store in June, and there they are, stacked by the door on a pallet, shoulder height, 40 pounds each, priced like a microwave. A man carries one out to the car himself, drops it into the window frame that evening, and never thinks about it again. No application, no committee, just a thermostat in the hallway, set once in May, and a house that stays at 72 degrees until September. So when the old continent says that it doesn't need air conditioning, it's describing a preference. Its own price list is describing a budget. It was never a value. It was a price. Would you still call it restraint if the thing you were nobly refusing cost you more than double what your neighbor across the ocean pays for it? Or would you quietly start calling it something else? And has anyone here ever met a European who bragged about how badly he slept in August, the way the rest of us brag about a holiday? Because the strange part isn't the price itself. The strange part is what Europe has printed on the bill underneath it. What is actually on the bill? Most of us believe that our electricity bill is the price of the electricity in it. It's a reasonable belief. It's also wrong, and the size of the error is difficult to describe politely. In the European Union, taxes and levies alone eat 28.9% of what your household pays for power. Add the network charges, the wires and the towers, and the upkeep of a grid we built for a colder continent, and the electricity itself, the actual energy, comes to 48% of what you are charged for it. The other half is infrastructure and politics. The network charges pay for the wires, the substations and the pylons, and for the long, expensive project of rebuilding a grid that was designed for a continent which had to heat itself and never seriously had to cool itself. The levies pay for policy. Subsidy schemes, social tariffs, and decarbonization programs bolted one by one onto the electricity bill because the electricity bill is the one place a government can reach every household without ever passing a new tax. And there's an asymmetry inside that, which almost nobody campaigns about. Gas, burned directly in a European kitchen, has escaped most of the equivalent charges. The cleanest way to run a home is the way carrying the heaviest load of structural cost. Then there's the half almost nobody outside the industry can explain. European power is sold at what is called the marginal price. The cheapest plants run first, and the last one switched on to meet demand sets the price for every plant behind it. That last plant is almost always a gas turbine, and a turbine is a wasteful way to turn fuel into light, so it needs roughly double what the gas cost. Every other generator is then paid that same price. The wind farm on the hill above your town made its power for almost nothing, and it is sold to you at the price of burning gas. You're not buying the electricity you're using. You're buying the electricity that was hardest to make. Now hold that beside a heat wave. When Europe gets hot, every household reaches for whatever cooling it owns in the same hour of the same afternoon, and the grid dispatches deeper and deeper into the expensive end of the queue. In the heat of 2025, wholesale power in Germany passed 400 euros a megawatt hour, and in Poland it went past 470. The hotter it becomes, the more the cold costs you. That isn't a market failure. That's the market working exactly as designed, by people who designed it before the summers changed. The bill is a policy document. So who exactly decided that your family should pay a multiple of the American price simply to survive a July night? And when did anybody put that decision in front of you to vote on? Now stop thinking about continents and megawatt hours for a moment, and think about one room. What one cool room costs. Imagine you're on the 4th floor of an apartment block in a European city, on the 11th evening of a heat wave. The building is doing what it was built to do, which is to hold on to its warmth. The window is open, and the air coming through it is warmer than the air inside. You've already tried the wet towel, the cold shower, the fan pointed at the ceiling, the trick with the bed sheet in the freezer. On a shelf in a shop 3 streets away, there's a machine that would end all of this before the kettle finished boiling, and you've done the arithmetic on it more than once. Here's the arithmetic, and you can run it on your own meter. One cooling unit drawing a kilowatt, 8 hours a day, through the 90 days of a European summer. Across the European average that comes to roughly 182 euros. In Germany, the same machine, the same hours, the same 90 nights, costs about 316. An American running a window unit through the identical summer pays somewhere between $130 and $190. The German is buying exactly the same volume of cold air and paying nearly double for it. And the arithmetic carries a cruelty inside it that no committee ever sat down and designed. The countries with the longest summers are, with a handful of exceptions, the countries paying the most for power. Italy and Spain both pay well above the European average, both pay roughly double the American price, and both have a cooling season that opens in May and doesn't let go until October. Italy alone accounts for about a third of all the electricity the European Union spends on air conditioning. The continent charges the most for cold air in exactly the places where cold air is least optional. The heat is not the punishment, the tariff is. None of which means our old buildings are innocent. Thick masonry does buy you something real, and a stone wall 2 centuries old genuinely will hold the nights cool into the middle of the following morning, right up until the night stops being cool, which across much of Europe it has now stopped doing, and Europeans have noticed. Household energy used for cooling across the European Union doubled in 6 years. In Cyprus, cooling now eats 16% of everything a household spends on energy. 16% of a household's entire energy budget spent on staying cool indoors. That is a sixth of everything a family spends on power, going out through the walls of a building that was never designed to keep heat out. And if a machine took a sixth of your energy budget every single year, would you call the neighbor who bought one wasteful, or would you finally call him solvent? Would you say it out loud in front of him? But if this were purely a matter of money, the pattern inside any single country would be uniform. In Germany, it's the opposite of uniform, and the shape of the exception is the most damning thing in this entire story. The office test. Our own statisticians keep count of this. Germany's Federal Statistics Office records what goes into every new building. In the new German buildings finished in 2025, cooling was installed in 37.8% of offices and administrative blocks. In new German homes, cooling was installed in 4.3%. That is the culture shock. And we published it ourselves, about ourselves. The same country, the same year, the same climate, the same engineers, the same suppliers, the same summer. The comparison Europe's defenders quote runs like this. At the same income, Europe sits 50 percentage points below the rest of the developed world, and what is left over, once you account for the money, is culture. Shutters closed at noon, long lunches in the shade, a continent that never treated comfort as an entitlement. It is a flattering account, and it explains nothing, because holding income equal does not hold the price of electricity equal, and 2 households on identical incomes are not buying the same kilowatt-hour at all. One of them is buying a far more expensive one. And thermal modesty does not switch itself off at the office door. The German, who is said to prefer a warm bedroom, does not become a different civilization the moment he walks into a building where the electricity is somebody else's problem. Where the occupant pays the bill, cooling is a cultural question. Where a company pays the bill, it is a purchasing decision, and it gets made. That is the office test. Run the test across the rest of the continent, and the culture keeps disappearing. In Greece, between 70 and 80% of households have air conditioning. In Italy, it's nearly 60. In Germany, fixed installations sit at around 6%, and in England at 4%. That is one continent, in 1 century. And the lectures about restraint come mostly from the countries at the bottom of that list, almost never from the ones at the top. Even inside a single country, the map splits along the price and the heat, not along the character. And if anyone still wants to insist that a national temperament simply can't be moved on this question, look at South Korea, which sat at about 6% a generation ago and sits at about 97% today. A culture didn't change. A cost did. So the nursery is cooled at one rate, and the boardroom at many times that rate, and it goes into the annual statistics as a housing figure. Nobody calls it what it is. Europeans are astonished by American thermostats, and untroubled by their own. Do you believe a nation can genuinely prefer to be hot where it sleeps, while insisting on being cool where it works? Or does the preference simply follow whoever is holding the invoice? And when did you last sit in an office you would never have paid to cool yourself? But there's a third wall, and it's the one that catches the Europeans who look at all of this, decide they have had enough, and reach for their own money. The permission slip. Suppose the German family on that fourth floor does the sum, accepts the cost, and decides to buy anyway. And here we discover the thing nobody warns us about, which is that in Europe, wanting it and affording it are not the last two steps. Across the European Union, 32% of the population lives in rented housing. In Germany, the figure is 53%, the highest share in the Union, which means that most German households don't own the wall they would need to drill. And drilling is where the shock lands. A split system has an indoor half and an outdoor half, and the outdoor half hangs on the outside of the building, which makes it a structural alteration, which makes it the landlord's decision and not the tenant's. In Italy, a renter needs the owner's permission. The owner is under no obligation to grant it, and no obligation to contribute a single euro if he does. In heritage-protected buildings and across the historic centers of the major Italian towns, installation is simply forbidden. In Britain, a listed building always requires planning permission for a cooling unit, with no permitted development exemption at all, and a separate listed building consent application on top of it. And the loudest version of this circulating online is simply false. The European Union never banned air conditioning. There's no directive outlawing a cooling unit, no Brussels prohibition, nothing to wave in the air. What exists is a refrigerant phase-out, an efficiency standard that removes the worst machines from the market, and a buildings directive about insulation. The truth is duller than the rumor, and considerably worse. Nobody banned it. Europe simply made it expensive, then made it somebody else's decision, and let the two things quietly do the work that a ban would have done loudly. How quietly? On the 17th of July 2026, the Federal Court of Justice in Karlsruhe, the highest civil court in Germany, ruled on whether a homeowners association could stop apartment owners from mounting a split unit on their own balcony. The court decided that it couldn't, and that the noise the machine makes while running isn't a lawful reason to refuse. Look at what that took. It took the Supreme Civil Court of Europe's largest economy, in the year 2026, to establish that a man who owns his flat may hang a box on his own balcony. And while that case crawled through the courts, the leader of Germany's Green Party stood up and demanded an immediate cooling program for the hospitals, the care homes, the daycare centers, and the schools. The environment minister answered by pointing at 100 billion euros already set aside for climate measures, and named not one building he intended to cool with it. Meanwhile, 14.5% of Germany's new daycare centers and nursing homes were going up with cooling in them. Now look at the numbers. Heat killed more than 20,000 people in Europe in June of 2026. More than 2,700 of them in France. Air conditioning cuts deaths in a heat wave by 75%. Measured against its own population, Europe loses roughly 5 times as many people to heat every year as America does. These are not numbers about comfort. They are numbers about which grandmothers are alive in September. Do you think the elderly woman on the top floor of that building in July was exercising a cultural preference? Or was she simply the last person in the chain who got no say in any of it? But 2 of those 3 walls are standing in America as well, and there's an American city that learned it the hard way. America's own cold coast. But this was never about wise Americans and foolish Europeans. It's that the wall is built out of money and permission behave the same way wherever you put them. More than 9 in 10 households in the American Midwest and in the South use air conditioning. Along the Pacific Marine Coast, the cool green strip running up through Oregon and Washington, it was 49%. Half of Northeast households don't run central air at all. They run window and wall units, the cheap kind, the kind Europe has mostly skipped in favor of a wheeled box with a hose out the window. Then in June of 2021, the heat dome arrived. Portland reached 116 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 47 degrees Celsius, in a city built on the assumption that it never would. The heat killed 441 people in Washington state. Around Seattle and Tacoma, 70% of rented homes had no cooling at all, and in Spokane, one household in 5 that owned a unit said plainly it could not afford to switch the thing on. But the old continent never bothered to read the rest of that story. America didn't inherit any of this either. In 1980, 27% of American homes had central air. By 2020, it was 67. That was a retrofit, carried out inside 2 generations, in a country whose housing stock also holds 19th-century brownstones and farmhouses older than the German Empire. The machines went into buildings never designed to receive them, because the power was cheap enough to run them, and because nobody needed a heritage authority's signature to hang one on a wall. Where those 2 conditions failed, on the wet green coast of Oregon, America looked exactly like Europe for 1 week. Then it went and bought the units. That is 2 of the 3 walls, standing in Washington state in 2021 exactly as they stand in Bavaria today. What Oregon never built was the 3rd one. Nobody in Portland spent that week telling themselves the heat was good for their character. They were shocked, and then they were angry, and then they went shopping. We were shocked, and then we explained ourselves. Which of those 2 do you think you have been living under? The verdict. So when the old continent says it doesn't need air conditioning, remember that Greece needs it, Italy needs it, the boardrooms of Frankfurt need it, and a German court needed a year to decide that a balcony is allowed to need it. The office test settles the rest. We are not cooler than America because we are wiser. We are warmer indoors because our power costs 2.5 times more, and because our walls belong to somebody else. America isn't perfect, and its own Pacific coast proved that in a single week of 2021. But there's a difference between a country that hasn't yet solved a problem and a continent that has decided to call the problem a personality. So one last question, and it isn't a rhetorical one. If it were your parents on the 4th floor, in the 11th night of a heat wave, would you want them living under a philosophy or under a working machine? Tell us in the comments below, and be specific about where you live, because the answer changes at every border. If this took a story you thought you already understood and turned it into a different one, take a second to like the video, which genuinely does help the algorithm carry it to people who are still repeating the sentence we opened with. Share it with whoever last told you that the old continent simply doesn't need cooling, because you now have the numbers and they do not. Then subscribe, and switch on the notification bell, which is the half of it people forget, so you don't miss the next investigation into an ordinary household object that turns out to have been decided for us somewhere else. Please note that this video was compiled from publicly available statistics, court records, and published reporting for the purposes of cultural comparison and public discussion. It does not represent the views of any government, agency, or organization, and it is not intended to belittle or attack the people of any country. Figures reflect the periods stated and change over time.